Hello and welcome to everyone who is participating in this webinar from around the world. My name is Alice Gibson. I am the Principal Manager for Capacity Development at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and I will be your MC or your host for today's webinar. The Asian Development Bank has a dedicated carbon capture and storage trust fund, which the Global CCS Institute and the UK governments are donors to. So we at the Institute are delighted to have Annika Sieler from the ADB talk to us about their recently developed roadmap for CCS demonstration and deployment for the People's Republic of China. And we're very lucky to have an additional panelist join the question and answer session at the end of Annika's presentation as well. And I will introduce him in the moment. But first, let me introduce you to our presenter. Annika Sieler has more than 15 years of international experience in economic and financial appraisal of energy sector projects, in regulatory, institutional and governance analysis. She's been working with the ADB since December 2011. As a finance specialist in the East Asia Energy Division, Annika is responsible for identifying, developing, processing and implementing ADB's loans and technical assistance projects for projects related to CCS, energy efficiency and clean fossil fuel power in the People's Republic of China. So quite a big job there, Annika, and you can see some of the projects that she has worked on listed on the slide. Now, you can see from this slide that we were going to have two panelists join us for the Q&A session. Unfortunately, Professor Jin Hong Kwang from the Chinese Academy of Sciences has not been able to join us for some technical reasons. So we do have on the line Tony Wood. Now, Tony leads the Grattan Institute's energy program. And for those who are perhaps unfamiliar with the Grattan Institute, that's an important policy think tank in Australia. He's also been the program director of the clean energy projects at the Clinton Foundation, where he advised governments in the Asia-Pacific region on low emissions technologies, including CCS. And it was in this role that he was a project leader for this roadmap. Prior to these roles, he spent 14 years working at Origin Energy at the senior executive level. So I think you'd agree that having Tony on the line will be a benefit to the Q&A session. Talking of the Q&A session, all participants are welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation through the questions tab on their GoToWebinar control panel, which you should be able to see on your screen and should look like what's on the slide there. So at the end of Annika's presentation, I'll be asking both her and Tony your questions that you have put through. If you did want to direct a question to a specific panel member, either Tony or Annika, please put their name at the beginning of your question. Otherwise, I will just address it to both of them and they can identify who is best placed to address the question. If we get similar questions coming through, I may combine questions together. So yeah, just keep that one in mind as well. And without any further ado, I will now hand over to Annika.
Thank you, Alice, for your kind introduction, and many thanks to you and the Global CCS Institute for giving the team the opportunity to present and consult with other stakeholders on the CCS roadmap for demonstration and deployment in the People's Republic of China. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in and taking the time to listen to what I have to present in the next few minutes. So after some introductory slide, I will present to you the key results and the key messages of the roadmap. We had the pleasure and honor to work with some of the most valued and experienced PSC experts in the field of climate change modeling, CCS technology, CO2 storage, hydrocarbon enhanced oil and gas recovery, and CCS financing, CCS regulation, and the and other aspects. The experts came from the Chinese Academy of Science, from AK 21, Tsinghua University, and Dalian University of Technology. These experts were supported by a group of international experts, which was led by Tony. And yes, you can see we had experts from the IEA Clean Coal Center, from the International Institute of Applied Sciences, the World Resource Institute, and the Clinton Climate Initiative. Our partner organization was the NDRC Department of Climate Change and the National Center for Strategy and International Cooperation on Climate Change. We believe these are the right organizations to push forward CCS demonstration. So the project was conceptualized in 2012, and then we had to identify and engage the right set of experts. Then the experts had all very respected personalities in their field, had to build up a team and had to exchange and had to come to same views. And after we had a draft roadmap, we went through a series of consultation with Chinese experts and practitioners in particular, and listened very carefully what they considered as important for demonstration and deployment. And we felt if we hadn't heard all Chinese stakeholders out, we couldn't formulate the document in a way where it is now. And we are very grateful that our donors have had the patience to go through this process. And yeah, so now I jump right in. So what were the major tasks? You can see those at the slide. And these major tasks were put into work packages, and 5 different reports were produced. A review of other roadmaps which currently exist, and drawing conclusions and lessons learned from those roadmaps to formulate this one. A review of the status of technology with a main focus on capture technology, but also looking at CO2 EOR and CO2 storage in saline aquifers. And projecting the cost for the development of CCS and the development of capture, with a particular focus on coal-fired power sector. Thirdly, a report on of the review of current projects in several stages of development, and conducting an initial ranking and showing a way how to rank early stage demonstration projects was prepared. Fourthly, a report on the proposed roadmap for regulation, which on the one hand includes the financial support and mechanism, as well as non-financial regulations and management standards. And from those, and fifthly, there was 2 reports on economic modeling and the relevance of CCS in given various CO2 emission trajectories. And then these 5 reports were then condensed into the roadmap. So on the review of other roadmaps, the team of experts reviewed a a series of roadmaps from various countries, including Australia, Canada, China itself, the US, UK, Malaysia, Poland, South Africa, and of course the international roadmap by the International Energy Agency. And the team found that all roadmaps share the common vision to accelerate development and deployment of CCS. But then, other than that, the roadmaps put emphasis on different aspects of CCS development. Second, the implementation is not always linked to the visions, goals, and plans in the original roadmap. Third, the roadmaps contracted by various research institutes and NGOs were more understood as guidance for the government for the potential and relevance of CCS. Fourth, actual development depends significantly on other factors. And fifth, the gaps, they identified some gaps in those roadmaps. So what they resulted in was that this roadmap should be scientific and manageable. So really looking at the facts and the status and the realities in China and make a practical assessment for CCS technology relevant for the PRC. Then it should be comprehensive, integrate strategic climate change objectives with technological innovation across different industries. It should be flexible enough to take uncertainties into account, and it should be inclusive to incorporate research and development as well as industry. So for the economic modeling, it was used to assess the fit of CCS in the PRC's climate change mitigation endeavors. Two complementary modeling frameworks are used. One, the China General Equilibrium Model of Tsinghua University, and two, the message model of the Yassa Institute. The CCUS potential for the power generation sector in this roadmap is primarily based on the estimates of the CGEM, or China General Equilibrium Model. The additional potential for CCUS in the industrial and particularly the liquids and chemical sector is based on the Yassa message model. Two alternative scenarios that allow the PRC CO2 emission peak in 2030 are compared with a continued efforts policy scenario. That's the upper line. The CEP represents an annual reduction of carbon intensity of 3% from 2016 to 2050. One alternative scenario, AS1, assumes an annual reduction in carbon intensity of 4% from 2016 to 2050. And the third line, AS2, assumes 4% between 2016 to 2030 and 4.5% between 2031 and 2050. The figure shows the CO2 emissions under each of those scenarios, and CCS is projected to play an important role for achieving a cost-effective reduction in CO2 emissions by shifting from the CEP scenario to either to the two scenarios. By 2030, CCS is projected to contribute about 40 million tons of CO2 per year in emission reduction, predominantly in the coal chemical sector. By 2040 and 2050, CCS can contribute up to 238 million tons and 1,428 million tons per year in the power sector, respectively. The share in 2030 and 2050 is 6% and 56%, and about 200 million tons and 900 million tons in the coal chemical sector. Next, the readiness of the PRC to launch CCS in the 13th five-year plan was assessed. And the experts came to the following conclusions. First, they resolved that the government had, since the 10th five-year plan, invested more than 3 billion renminbi in research and development. To date, 9 pilot projects are in operation in the power sector and the coal chemical sector. The PRC has one of the largest pilot projects in saline aquifer storage, notably the Xianhua project. There's a large number of large-scale CCS demonstration projects in the pipeline at various stages of development. Then over recent years, the Chinese government has established very close cooperation with a number of organizations and governments to do further research on CCS, and all those programs have added to the body of knowledge on CCS in the PRC. The current China is also very active in developing management standard and regulation. The current policies on climate change, they all mention CCS as one possible option, but there are no specific regulations to date or no targets. So as a result, the team concluded that the PRC has built up a large capacity over a range of technologies across the CCS chain. That basic regulatory framework, especially for CO2 EOR, is existing or could be modified to suit CCS. And that China is actually ready to move towards a large-scale demonstration. Secondly, the team of experts also concluded that China has a unique low-cost CCS demonstration opportunity in the coal chemical sector. The coal chemical sector to date has about 200 plants providing about 300 million tons of CO2 annually, which are an attractive source for CCS. And in the process of the coal chemical plants, a high purity CO2 stream is actually generated as, we can say, byproduct. And so you don't have to capture it separately, and all you need to do is to compress, transport it to be stored. So the production of the high purity stream or the capture is part of the production process of the coal chemical end product, and thus is charged to the end product. It was very important to pick such a low-hanging fruit, because if ever, the experts felt, the first of its kind demonstration project would be extremely costly. It would have a detrimental effect on CCS development in the PRC. So that is a great opportunity. And finally, China has conducted, and the major national oil companies all have conducted tests on CO2 EOR and various stages, and do have the experience. Then CO2 storage capacity potential was estimated. It should be noted that to date, the estimates are highly uncertain, and in the PRC there's particularly a lack of consistent evaluation models and a standardized assessment methodology. Second, the there is a lack of a comprehensive data set, and thirdly, the integrity of the data is not necessarily given. Most studies have used a range of approaches and various sets of data. So the estimates vary widely. For this roadmap, the estimates have reviewed 23 main onshore basins and 9 mainshore offshore basins, and 216 oil and gas fields, and concluded that China has altogether about 1,900 million tons of CO2 storage capacity in saline aquifers and about 35 in oil and gas fields. What it shows is that China definitely has sufficient pore space to store CO2 as projected under this roadmap. It further shows that in the medium term, China has to move to saline aquifers and for storage. This graph shows you high levels for sink matching produced for this roadmap. The different triangles show the key emission sources. The black ones, those below 5 million tons of CO2, and the purple ones above 10 million tons. Then the green and red circles are the oil and gas fields, so the early storage opportunities for the oil fields. And the areas are the main basins, and orange indicates low suitability and neon green a high suitability. And then finally the dotted circles around the triangles indicate a radius of about 200 kilometers where CCS is considered still feasible, because at the beginning you will probably do a test and then transport it by truck before you build a pipeline, and if you have to transport it over a much larger distance, then a project is losing its viability. Oh, let me just go back for a second, sorry. So by looking at it on the first or second view, you already get an idea where probably a first key priority area for CCS would be in the PRC. And the consultant concluded that probably the main criteria or main basin is the Ordos Basin. So this report on early stage opportunities looked at the large-scale demonstration projects in the CCS, Global CCS Institute database, and then carried out a ranking of technical, financial, and other institutional and other criteria to come up with this initial ranking. And the first one they identified is CCUS network project. Okay, let me go to the challenges. CCS is facing formidable challenges in the PRC. First of all, CCS is highly capital intensive. CCS demonstration project must overcome the commercial viability gap between high upfront capital cost and associated incremental operating cost and the lack of additional revenues. Theoretically, revenues can be secured from the industrial production and sale of captured CO2 for enhanced hydrocarbon recovery, or from if there is a carbon market from the emissions allowances. The team of experts then did this benchmarking, where they benchmarked the levelized cost of electricity for a power plant without CCS, then with CCS, and then with EOR. What this graph on the right-hand side shows you is that even without EOR, CCS on a coal-fired power plant already is comparable to the cost of offshore wind and solar in the PRC. I have to say that the expert had a very vivid discussion about the actual cost, and there's a high uncertainty with regards to that. But when we consulted also with practitioners on the cost, this is what we have finally agreed to. Another main barrier, of course, in China is the energy penalty and the water footprint, which is a huge challenge and requires innovative solutions, especially in a water-stressed and energy-insecure country like the PRC. Fourthly, one point which was always pointed out by the PRC experts was that the currently existing demonstration projects do not really have much value for the PRC because they are mainly pre-combustion on natural gas processing. And in China, it will be on coal-fired power or on coal-based processes. But we are very delighted that now the Sask Power project is there, and we are very grateful to the Sask Power company to share so actively its experiences. And I think it's very important for future development also in the PRC. As I said, there are basic regulations which can be adapted for first demonstration projects, but moving forward to deployment and a more large-scale demonstration, China needs to develop a complete regulatory framework. And to date, we are lacking management standards, policies, and regulations. Another aspect, as I just said, because CCS will mainly happen on power plants in the medium to long term, it requires cooperation between unlikely partners, so power generators and oil companies. And to make this cooperation work requires understanding and requires regulation. Finally, there is the team of experts found that there is by and large a lack of public awareness and support. And looking at experience like you had in Germany, where the public opposition was the main or a key factor that the government decided not to look at CCS. The expert said that one key aspect to further develop CCS is to do more work on public awareness. And a key measure for raising public awareness is an early stage demonstration project. So coming to the key messages, the experts concluded that from the economic modeling that CCS demonstration and deployment is essential for cost-effective climate change mitigation in the PRC. Due to its high coal intensity and despite vigorous efforts to improve energy efficiency and being the world leader of renewable energy, CCS is the only available technology that can catch up to 90% of CO2 emission from large industrial processes and power plants, and therefore CCS is essential. Without CCS, the cost of meeting the country's anticipated long-term climate change mitigation efforts are considered or estimated to be about 25% more expensive, but at the same time, early demonstration is essential to move CCS forward. And to bring CCS to cost where it then be the costs are at a deployable level. Secondly, the PRC can benefit from international experiences. Currently, there are 13 large CCS projects in operation, and there are more than 300 of pilots of operation which have been testing CCS or various aspects successfully. So all these experiences are important to further learn, and it is important for cost reduction to uphold those international corporations which the Chinese government is already pursuing very vividly. Thirdly, as I explained, China has a unique low-cost CCS demonstration opportunity. Fourthly, CCS demonstration has to find adapted solutions, and in absence of targeted support, it faces formidable challenges. So targeted support is essential for early stage projects. And finally, a phased approach is needed for CCS demonstration. So with this, I show you the roadmap graph. The first phase is considered from 2015 to 2020, and it's called the early CCUS opportunities phase. In this phase, it is expected that 5 to 10 projects in the coal chemical sector should be commenced and ideally implemented. But given the relevance of the power sector in the medium to long term, particularly the practitioners actually felt that it's essential that at least 1 to 3 power plant CCS projects on a power plant is also implemented. The second phase is called the expansion phase, which is 2020 to 2030. And the third phase is the commercialization phase. As you can see, the red line is really the roadmap graph. And we expect that 10 to 20 million tons may be stored up to 2020, then 40 to 50 million tons up to 2030, and then it goes up to 2,500, roughly highly uncertain estimate on up to 2050. And essential for commercialization is the cost development of capture technologies. One, the first generation pre-combustion, post-combustion oxy-fuel, but then later on innovative solutions, in particular adapted to the Chinese situation. So in particular, the vision is that the coal chemical sector might be combined with power generation. In the middle of the graph, you can see this big green arrow in it says that in preparation deployment of CCS in the power sector, it is essential that power plants are built as CCS ready. So it's expected that another 400 gigawatt of coal-fired power generation will be added to the Chinese system from about 800 to 1,200. While it's expected that those coal-fired power plants will be some of the most efficient coal-fired power plants in the world, they will still constitute a net absolute increase, a significant increase in CO2 emissions. While they can be retrofitted with CCS, not designing them CCS ready make a retrofit economically or technically unfeasible. So for us, an essential part of this roadmap is this CCS ready. So as my last slide, I have the key policy actions in the near term. First, the experts recommend that CCUS is integrated in the set of the PRC government's portfolio of low-carbon energy technologies, that 5 to 10 demonstration projects in the coal chemical sector are implemented or started at least, and 1 to 3 early stage demonstration projects in the coal-fired power sector are commenced. It is encouraged that the PRC government sets a target for CCUS, and that includes a target for CO2 captured and stored, as well as a target for additional barrels of oil produced from CO2 EOR. Fourthly, it is highly recommended to select a priority region where early stage demonstration projects are selected. China has made in many of its policies, economic reform policies, this approach to select a region or a city where it tests its new reforms. And in particular for CCS, because the opportunity of building up a network of CO2 pipelines, which currently do not exist in China, this is a great fit where China, on the one hand, has already this established practices of using a test area, and B, especially for CCS, you can realize economies of scale in the transportation cost. Fifthly, enabling policies should be announced. So one, I already explained, the CCS ready policy. Then two, a CO2 EOR to facilitate the cooperation between unlikely partners. And as part of that, a standard CO2 offtake agreement should be published. China in 2014 published a standardized natural gas offtake agreement. So it fits very well where a lot of clauses in the natural gas offtake agreement can actually be adapted and to CO2. Then establish a targeted financial support program for early stage demonstration projects. And existing environmental regulations should, as much as possible, adapted. And China should start with developing its regulatory framework for CCS, so that it's when CCS goes into the expansion phase, a regulatory framework is in place. As I already mentioned, it is very important that in this early demonstration phase, the government and natural NGOs work on public awareness on CCS and share information. And finally, for the industries who will eventually capture and transport and develop those projects, it is very essential that the institutional framework is clarified, the approval process, and who's responsible for what. With this, I thank you very much for listening, and I hand over to Alice. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. And certainly it sounds like a very comprehensive roadmap. Now, I do have some questions that have come through already, but I invite you all to submit any further questions you might have using that questions tab on your control panel. So please, yes, keep sending them through. In the meantime, Annika, I'll start with a very relevant question. When will the roadmap be published?
So the plan is sometime in June.
So it's still kind of being finalized at the moment.
It has to go through our publishers, and yeah, and then we have to find a good time to launch it. But yeah, the plan is June.
Excellent. Now this one is a slightly provocative question. We've all seen CCS roadmaps come and go. What's different about this one?
Well, I have tried to explain that the experts have tried to draw lessons from earlier ones, and this roadmap really considers technology as well as is looking at early demonstration projects, and is looking between the correlation between demonstration and deployment and technology innovation, and includes the key steps. And then finally, I think we have worked with the institution which has, on the one hand, an inherent interest to make CCS happen and has the power to do it. This is, but apart from that, it is also it has also commonalities with others. And I invite Tony to share his views.
Thank you, Annika. I think that we did, as Annika explained, spend quite a lot of time reviewing various strategies and plans under the heading of roadmaps for CCS. And many of these were developed in countries for very specific purposes, such as the technology roadmap or technology development roadmap or a broad strategy roadmap. But what we were keen to do was provide to the Chinese government, through the agencies that Annika has indicated, a practical roadmap that would incorporate an understanding of technology and development and deployment, large-scale demonstration, but a map that could actually be followed in a practical way. So a lot of the detail, some of which Annika has indicated, much of it which is in the detailed roadmap, talks about how the government could actually implement this roadmap to meet the objectives at lowest cost that China will have as a member of the global community. And so we were quite excited to be able to do that, and we think we've been able to bring this together. Of course, it remains the prerogative of the national government to determine how it will adopt this roadmap, if at all, but we're optimistic that we've been able to, in 2015, produce what we think is a pretty robust way of thinking about, from a government perspective, how CCS can contribute to its objectives.
Thanks, Tony. Another question. You flagged that there are a number of information gaps for CO2 storage capacity in China. Does the ADB or the Chinese government intend to undertake activities to improve the understanding of CO2 storage capacity in China?
Yeah, thank you, Alice. I might share with you that we are currently working with the China Huanan Group and to develop a full-scale 100,000 ton CCUS pilot on the Tianjin IGCC power plant. And while this is one project on, we have been looking at various sites in the Bohai Basin. And this project has given us very good insights on what are the barriers, especially in CO2 EOR. So this is more on making CO2 EOR happen, but it also shows that this data gap, and especially this is particular to China. This data is considered as of strategic importance, so it's not openly available. So it is very important that more tests are done in more basins, also on both on oil fields as well as saline aquifers. So at the moment, we are doing this pilot project, and we learn a lot from that one. In the future, let's hope that we get other opportunities. But then there are other donors who or partners and the Chinese oil companies themselves who do those tests. But you will not find that they will be published on the web like in the US. But
so
the
often they exist. I was just going to say, Annika, often they exist, but it's not necessarily accessible. That some of that information.
Yes, the relevant, yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I totally cut you off there. Did you want to finish?
No, it's okay. That's fine.
And I was also going to, I thought you made an interesting point that it's a challenge for a number of countries where that data held particularly by oil and gas companies is very protected, and it can be a challenge to share that more widely.
Yeah.
Moving on to the next question. As we come towards COP21, this person understands that the PRC has targeted to peak its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Has the Chinese government or the NDRC specifically outlined CCS as contributing to this target? Or really they're contributing to their emissions reduction targets, it should be.
I think to date they have not published that, to my awareness.
Tony, did you have any?
Publicly, all countries have indicated that they will be making their submissions to the international community ahead of COP21, many of them by the middle of the year, including China. They will be setting targets beyond 2020, and they'll be talking about the domestic policies that will give credibility to those targets. I'm sure most of the people on this webinar would be aware that the Chinese President, Xi Jinping, made some very clear announcements about that peaking of emissions by 2030. I think we can expect that the way in which the government works, from my understanding, is that then the various targets, the various specific targets that would support achieving that broader target will gradually be developed and will be probably more likely published in the lead up to that plan, and certainly as part of the 13th five-year plan for China, which begins next year. So I think Annika is correct. We haven't seen it publicly released, but we were hoping and expecting that the government will talk about the various mechanisms that will enable China to achieve the targets set out by the President. We'll see more detail about those in the coming months and the next year.
And I think this would have been good to have our Chinese colleague, Professor Jin, on the line, because my understanding was that CCS had been identified in some of their key climate change policies. But I think that's something we can certainly check with the Institute's China office. Annika,
Alice, if you allow me, Yeah, I think I just wanted to say they do have mentioned in the in its long-term plan on low carbon technologies. CCS is mentioned in China's white paper on energy. Of 2012, and also in the National Action Plan on Climate Change, CCS is mentioned. But
right, but
I
not
thought
sort of
you asked for a specific target
the specific
on
targets
CCS.
aren't
Yeah.
identified. Yeah, I think that that's a good good thing to clarify. Have a question here. Can you comment on China's potential to build CCS demonstration plants at lower costs now, and their ability to then contribute to sort of global cost reductions on CCS?
Okay, I may start. I think the experts' view was always that yes, China has definitely the capacity to build CCS large-scale plants, and also at a lower cost than in other countries. And then the hope is that, like looking at what happened in the solar PV space or in other low carbon technologies, that then China can be a main driver for bringing costs down. Tony, please add if
yeah, look, I think the key point here is that even though I know when people who are not close to the technologies associated with CCS have a view that the technology is still very immature, the technologies are well understood. What's immature is the commerciality of those technologies, because they're still very much at the early pilot stage or very, very early demonstration stage, as Annika indicated. So what makes a big difference is the learning that can occur as a result of developing projects and replication. So already I'm sure people will be aware that the SaxPower project that Annika referred to, there have been public comments about even after one project, the expectation would be that the cost of the second project would be significantly cheaper. The big opportunity in China is that compared to many parts of the developed countries, such as the United States or UK, etc., Australia included, we're not seeing significant build of new coal-fired power stations with or without CCS. So as a result, we're not seeing the opportunity to build these projects and drive down the costs, even if the policies were in place to support it. So the big opportunity in China is two things. Firstly, as Annika explained, in the coal chemical sector, to have low-cost capture, and secondly, through developing projects as the industry is growing more rapidly than it is in other parts of the world, to drive down the cost. And that's why the view of both the national and the international experts is that China is in a very unusually fortunate position to be able to have that influence.
And if I can just add the experience what we have made in case of the Tianjin IGCC project is that China has such a large scope and capacity, especially in the coal-fired power sector, that even the first of its kind project has been faster than anywhere else in the world to reach its full capacity and high standard of reliability. And the Chinese power generators are so capable that we are, well, I'm a strong believer that the first project could make a huge difference already in the country. So I'm very confident what I learned from this process.
You touched on a couple of things in your answers which are relevant to the next question, which is, with the major potential for CO2 emission reductions represented by the coal-fired power plants, would it not make more sense to focus on demonstration projects on coal-fired power plants rather than the coal chemical industry?
Okay, so I disagree, because as I pointed out before, is especially for the very first project, it was very important for the experts that the very first project should also be an example in terms of cost efficiency. So, and there is a risk in the coal-fired power sector that there's a certainty that this project would be very costly. So in this regard, the early stage projects are also there. One, to raise awareness. Two, is to prove that the technology works. B, that storage is safe and that CO2 can be transported safely. And so these are the main key points in the early demonstration project. If you combine it with a very high cost, then there was a risk. And then secondly, I believe that the coal chemical sector is also a very important source of CO2 emissions, as I told before or during my presentation. So it's expected that by 2020, 1 gigaton of CO2 emissions will come from this sector alone. So why shouldn't you try to first go for a sector where you can make a very big, important progress in reducing emissions and where it's low cost? So, yeah.
All right, now I think we have I was going to say we're kind of running out of time, so I might squeeze one more question in if you can keep the answer relatively short. And the question is, I think it's an important one, how much of the roadmap has been supported by industry? And have the Chinese, have the Chinese entities involved been drawn from industry as well?
Okay, so the experts were mainly academic, from the national experts, while the international experts come from institutions which have worked also in the development of projects. But we have, as I mentioned, gone through several rounds of stakeholder consultations, and we have done some surveys with the banking industry, but we have in particular consulted with the power generators, with the coal chemical industry, with the oil companies. So, and we always share the documents and our draft policy notes, and they have shared their views on it. And we have done adjustments, for example, on the CCS capture cost projections, or also on the barrier analysis. So we did consult.
You did engage industry. And I'm going to have to cut you off there because we are now out of time. Just moving on to the next slide. We didn't get through all the questions. If you had a burning question that we didn't get to, please do submit it to the Institute's webinar inbox, which you see at that email address on the slide there. The other thing to note is that this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the Institute's website, along with a copy of the presentation in the next sort of 3 or 4 days or so. Lastly, as you are leaving this session, we do have a very quick 3-question survey that we would really appreciate you taking the time to answer as you log off. That helps us improve our webinar program. So in conclusion, I hope you found this webinar valuable and useful, and thank you for your attendance, and goodbye.